Good morning. Oh, it's so good to be here. I know that there are going to be some of you who are surprised to see me again so soon. As my daughter said, I'm like a bus. You wait for ages and then you get two at once. So I hope you enjoy the blessing of that. Do you know what? I have enjoyed the blessing of really falling into this story of Abraham and Isaac. It's one of those stories that so often we just skate over. And one of the things I've been praying this week is that God would break the ice and that I would fall into this story and explore some of the depth of it so that I would be able to share it with you today. It's good to be able to talk on the topic of how God provides. I was saying to someone this week, do you know, I think I could talk for an hour, maybe longer than an hour, about how God has provided, how he has been provider in my life. In the time that we were in missions, in the time when I was a student, in the times when in the last year, in this time of living through pandemic, we can look back and see so many ways that God has provided for us financially, with friendships, and actually with the faith to live through some of those times that have been difficult and trying for us. God has provided. And I am looking forward in the next few weeks to being in my garden with 5 other people around the fire and sharing some of those stories about how God has been our provider in the last 6 months, in the last 12 months. I'm looking forward to hearing your stories. I'm looking forward to sharing my stories. But actually this morning, what I'm going to share is one of the stories from the Bible, which is maybe one of the ultimate stories about how God provides. And there is so much beauty in it, and it is so difficult at the same time. This story of Abraham and Isaac. So let's just dive in, shall we? It's the story of a test. It's a story of a test of a man called Abraham who God had chosen and who honestly mostly messed up. I was trying to think of an analogy, and the best one that I could think of is my dog, Ted, who occasionally is obedient and gets it right, and nearly always isn't obedient and gets it wrong. Actually, some of my friends on the Derby leadership team witnessed this week over Zoom Ted stealing a sandwich which I was making when I went off to answer the door. He was caught in the act. He tends more to get it wrong, and Abraham honestly tends more to get it wrong than he gets it right. So around the fire is where these stories would originally have been told. So I want you to try this morning to set yourself in that gathering around the fire. Try and imagine. But he did partly obey God, and then a couple of weeks ago, you'll have heard me talking about one of Abraham's huge mistake. The story that's in the chapter before this one, in chapter 21, is the story of how Sarah has her miracle baby, Isaac. How God's promise of a nation suddenly is a reality in front of them. Of how God promises that this baby, that this child, that all of the promises rests in this child, that this seed of this child is going to go forward into the future and be a blessing to all nations. That this is how Abraham's name is going to be known, in this child. And you'll have seen Sarah get jealous of the other child, of Abraham's firstborn son, Ishmael. And then you'll have seen Abraham at his lowest point. You'll have seen the point where Abraham sends Hagar and his firstborn child out into the wilderness with a skin of water and a loaf of bread. That's like sending somebody out into the desert with virtually nothing, with a meal deal from Tesco. It's like one sandwich and one bottle of water. Abraham was sending them to their deaths. We can't get away from that. We can't get away that that's the choice that he was making when he sent them off into a wilderness with not enough to live on for more than 2 or 3 days. Now, if you've been around the fire, you'll have seen God come in and rescue Hagar. You'll have seen the point where where she's got to the end of herself, where she's laid her child underneath a bush, underneath a tree, and you've seen her look up and see a well. And you'll have seen God make promises to her that she will be a nation. But do you know, Abraham hasn't seen that. Abraham, we don't know, but we think Abraham probably doesn't know that God has rescued his firstborn. So maybe that explains a bit of his reaction when this happens. Genesis 22, verses 1 to 6. After these things, God tested Abraham's faith. God said to him, "Abraham," and he answered, "Here I am." Then God said, "Take your only son Isaac, the son you love, and go to the land of Moriah. Kill him there and offer him as a whole burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." Abraham got up early in the morning and saddled his donkey. He took Isaac and 2 servants with him. After he cut the wood for the sacrifice, they went to the place God had told them to go. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servant, "Stay here with the donkey. My son and I will go over there and worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the sacrifice, and he gave it to his son to carry. But he himself took the knife and the fire. So he and his son went on together. We are shocked by this story, aren't we? We are shocked. We are shocked because we know who God is. We are shocked because we have the advantage of seeing Leviticus, and we've got the advantage of seeing how God reacts to the people who do child sacrifices in Kings and in Judges. We know that God hates child sacrifice. So we are shocked. And when I first read this story the other week, I thought, well, Abraham, how come you didn't just say, "God, you're not like that. This is not you"? Well, the thing is, Abraham didn't know that yet. Because Abraham is there, and actually all of these people around the fire for hundreds of years, they are living surrounded by cultures where child sacrifice was normal. And that is breathtakingly awful, but it is true. That's what Abraham has grown up surrounded with. Every place that he's been, in where he grew up, in Egypt, where he's been, in Canaan, all of those places had child sacrifice as the way to get God's pleasure when you'd upset it. The way to get the way to show your devotion to God was to sacrifice a child that you loved. So this is not shocking to the people around the fire. The shocking part is coming later. I want to just think about this answer of Abraham. I think Abraham is a bit broken at this point. I think he realizes what he's done in sending his firstborn out into the desert to die. I think that "here I am" is a surrender. And it's interesting because the person who wrote this story marks with a "here I am" 3 points in the story. And so here's the first point in the story that we can really pay attention to, and that is God saying, "Take your only son who you love and go to Moriah." Did you notice that? It's almost the same name as the place that Abraham went to in the beginning when he first arrives in Canaan. God is almost taking him back to the beginning. And he's telling him it's going to be up a mountain, and mountains were the places where you went to meet with God. There's a place where Abraham has been in his life to meet with God is up mountains. And so the mountain is a place where you expect something to happen. And Abraham here realizes there is going to be a reckoning. He is being called to meet with God at this point in his life where he's just realized he's done the worst thing that he's ever done. I don't know what Abraham is feeling, but I think his heart is struggling in this place because he doesn't fight. He's called to a mountain, to a reckoning. Now we know, spoiler alert, we know that God rescued Ishmael. And we know, spoiler alert, who God is. So we know that God is going to rescue Isaac. But the people around the fire don't know that. And Abraham doesn't know that. But we do know that it took him 3 days to get there, and we also know that it's only a 1 day's walk. So I think that reveals to us something of what is going on in Abraham's heart at this moment. The wrestling that is happening between the promise that he has embraced, the promise that he has finally embraced, that he is going to be the father of a nation that blesses other nations. The promise that has become a part of him, that this child is going to be the future. And he is wrestling between that and God saying, this is the appropriate thing. You know, Abraham, you the firstborn child that I gave you, you have thrown away. So give me back this next child. So I wonder if Abraham thought that it was awful but kind of reasonable. So I'm going to go onwards. So he and his son went on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father." Abraham answered, "Here I am, my son." Isaac said, "We have the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the sacrifice?" And Abraham answered, "God himself will give us the lamb for the sacrifice, my son." Now, I think this is a point of the story that I have not paid attention to before when I've been reading it. But when I started to read it, I realized that this is the point of the story where I needed to be paying the most attention. Because the person who wrote down this story has put a frame around it. The next line is, Abraham and his son went on together. Those two lines, which are identical, form a frame around this story. And not only that, but he's also put the sticker on it. The "Here I am" is in this story. So here we have this little exchange between Abraham and Isaac, and the writer has put a frame around it and he's put a sticker on it and said, pay attention. I wonder what it would be like if we were able to open a window into Abraham's heart in this moment. The turmoil of it, the fight. I think everything in you, as a parent, or actually as a spiritual parent, everything that's in you wants to protect the child that is in front of you. Everything in you wants to keep them safe. And Abraham's carrying the promise that this is the child that is the future of God's promise to him, the future of blessing the nations is in this child. And Abraham's carrying that promise, and yet he is carrying this command of God to go and sacrifice Isaac at the top of the mountain. And as he's walking up that mountain, carrying a knife which must seem very heavy in his hand, living in that moment of turmoil between what he thinks is best and what God is telling him to do. In that moment, Isaac turns to him and says, "Daddy." And it must have been like a knife into his heart, mustn't it? And as he turns and says, "Here I am," in this place of incredible pain and incredible confusion, actually, finally, Abraham's faith is somehow made complete. He somehow gets it. God is going to provide. I don't know how, but I know who God is. I don't know how, but somehow God is going to find a way to be faithful to the promises that he has made. Because that's where faith really is. Faith is in this place where God says something and I believe it. And then I step out onto it. And at the point that I step out onto it, it becomes solid and load-bearing. And then I'm standing in a place where I can take one step more. That's how faith seems to work. That God says something, that we believe it, and that as we step onto it, it becomes completed and load-bearing. It says in James makes a commentary on this story, and he says, "You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did." It's not enough to hear. It's not enough to believe. You've got to be in the place of stepping into it. Even in this struggle, for once Abraham lets go of what he thinks is the right thing to do, of what he thinks is the good thing to do. And he puts himself into God's hands. On Thursday, Friday, we'll be looking to Gethsemane, and we'll be looking to the place where Jesus struggled, where Jesus' heart was in turmoil, where he struggled with what God was asking him to do. And he eventually let go of the struggle and puts himself into God's hands. Now what happens is that Abraham and his son do go on together, and Abraham does lay his son on top of the wood, just like Hagar laid her son underneath the wood. Abraham lays his son bound on top of the wood. He gets to that point, he lifts the knife, and at that point, God says to him, "Abraham, Abraham." And Abraham says, "Here I am." He's in surrender. And God says, "Don't kill your son or hurt him. I can see that you trust God, that you have not kept your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham looked up. And what Abraham saw was a ram hanging in a tree, caught by its horns. And Abraham took that ram and he used that as a sacrifice instead. And his relationship with God was restored. And he got forgiveness for that terrible sin that he had committed. It's a substitute. Isaac's life is redeemed. God keeps his promise. Do you know, for hundreds of years after this, on this mountain where this happened, Mount Moriah, the people of God remembered and celebrated that forgiveness by sacrificing a lamb. Because this is the place where the temple was built. This is the hill that Jerusalem was built around. This is the path that Jesus walks up on Palm Sunday to the temple. This is the journey that Jesus travels, the journey that Abraham travels. And they remembered this year on year on the Day of Atonement. They celebrated the forgiveness that God gave Abraham at that place, the forgiveness that God gave to his people, the redemption of the people, the fulfillment of the promise in spite of Abraham's sinfulness in that place by the ram hanging in a tree. And they celebrated that provision of God. And the Bible tells us that even today, when this was written down, people say, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. And they did that until one day when God provided something even better. And of course, we look ahead to Good Friday, and that's where we'll be going. That God provided something even better. So if Abraham can be forgiven his sin through this journey of faith, then how much more can we be forgiven ours through the sacrifice that Jesus made for us? I don't know how, but somehow God is always going to find a way to be faithful to his promises. His promises to you, his promises to me, his promises to us as a people. I don't know how, but I know that God will be faithful to his promises. And that is the journey of faith. That is the test that Abraham finally passed. And that is a test that stands before each of us today. I'm going to pray. Father in heaven, thank you that you are our provider. I pray that you would provide more faith for each of us to walk the tests that get set before us. And we thank you so much for that greatest provision of all, your Son dying in our place so that we can be forgiven, so that we can once again walk in relationship with you. Thank you so much.
Amen.
Amen.